And tonight, we are here to talk about air itself and the variety of ways that it shapes the city and that we might not have noticed. So, with me here, I guess I'll start at the furthest away from me with Les Robertson. He is the principal of Leslie Robertson Associates, which is the structural engineering consultancy behind 3 of the 6 tallest buildings in the world. And he was the engineer of record for the World Trade Center towers. So he actually is the man who figured out how to make them not sway too much. There was some...
That's the old World Trade Center, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. We can see the new one, yeah. In the middle, we have William Bryant Logan. He is the author of Air, which is an excellent book you should pick up at your local store, as well as many other books. I also really recommend Dirt. Air was chosen as one of the 100 notable books of 2012 by the New York Times Book Review. He's also president of Urban Arborists, Inc., a Brooklyn-based tree company, and is on faculty at New York Botanical Gardens. And then finally, closest to me, we have Robert von Ancken, chairman of Landauer Evaluation and Advisory, a division of Newmark Grubb Knight Frank. And he has over 45 years of experience in the real estate business as an appraiser, consultant, expert witness, and licensed real estate broker. But he's here tonight because of his expertise in appraising air rights, which is his specialty, including such New York City landmarks as Grand Central Terminal, Madison Square Garden, Penn Station, and so on. So, air rights, dealing with the movement of air and everything in the air. The format of tonight is that I am going to ask a few questions, maybe half an hour's worth of questions, and then I'm going to open it up to you guys to jump in with questions of your own. So save them up for a little bit, and then I'll open it up. Okay, so I thought I would start with a question for all 3 of you to answer with your own way of looking at air. There are lots of different ways of thinking about and defining air, and I thought I would just start at the very basic level with how you, in your business life or in the people that you write about, think about and define air. What aspect of it matters to you?
Well, I'll go first. What matters to me is basically, I'm an appraiser, and I do a huge volume of appraisal of properties considering air rights. So to me, what's very important is the value associated with air rights. We live in New York City, and New York City, especially Manhattan, is probably the only place in the world where there's so many transfers of air rights. And they're used in order to enlarge certain buildings, but there's all kinds of profit potential that are associated with the purchase or sale of air rights. And that's why I'm here, and I'd like to just talk a little bit later on about the zoning and air rights and how you go about valuing it and what it all means for development.
Give us a ballpark average for a square foot of New York air rights.
Well, you have to understand that property is sold by what's called floor area. For every square foot that you can develop, you pay a certain dollar amount. And if you aren't purchasing air rights, but you're purchasing fee land, and the land could be typically developed in many of the zones, like the zone right here in this area, is 10 times. So you could develop a building which is 10 times the size of the lot. The lot here is, say, 20,000 square feet, so you could build a building on it of 200,000 square feet. Now the air rights would get added on top of that. So the land is worth, generally, concepts are, it's worth $350 today to about $500 a square foot. However, there are new sales that are coming out since the beginning of 2013 for major property acquisitions and development, which are in the category of $700 to $1,000 a square foot of land. And those will all be developed with condominium buildings. And the thought is that the condominiums will be selling at $3,000 a square foot. So if you sell them at $3,000 or $2,800 a square foot, it costs you $600 or $700 to build them. You can afford to pay $1,000 a square foot for the land and still make a very good profit, and that's what's happening. And air rights get it piled on top of that. So in this building, if this building needed air rights and the building next to it was only 5 stories, it could purchase the air rights, providing it's contiguous to that building, and you could buy the air rights and pile them on top. And those sales, historically, have always been about 60 to 65%, it's going up now, of the price of fee land. So if the fee land is worth $400 a square foot, the air rights go for about $250, $240. That's pretty certain. And there's so many different sales, like if we would add up all the air rights sales that occurred in 2013, the average is about $260. And if you add all of them up, then there are maybe 40 that occurred in 2012. The average is about $250 from all these sales, the higher and the lower ones. So it's pretty steady.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on how you define air in your field of work or the people you write about?
Sure. Well, in my field, I'm an arborist, so I'm kind of naturally prejudiced towards living things. And air is made great use of by trees. But what I found in writing the book, when I write these books, I kind of start from a more or less a layman's knowledge. And what shocked and interested me most as I started to write about the air was how not only trees, but most things alive are transformed by what occurs in the air. Some of those processes are purely physical processes, but most of them are processes that involve exchange of living substances. Of course, oxygen, carbon dioxide are necessary for all living things. Nitrogen, too, comes ultimately from the air, but is usually fixed by the very few organisms that can fix it out of the air and then recycled and recycled and recycled. So there's continual exchange between the things that are alive and the air. And of course, that's mediated by the weather, which carries things all over the world and then pulls up water vapor far enough to drop it again so that it can fall and make things fruitful. But the thing that most surprised and shocked me was how much invisible contents there is in all the air we breathe at all times. And maybe I'll talk a little later about some of the things. I've done some interesting air samples in New York City and found some interesting and sometimes shocking things, what we breathe every day. In fact, I showed I teach in a Midtown center, I teach nature writing, and I took a sample one winter in from the classroom, and I didn't show it until the last class because I was afraid that the students wouldn't come back. It was just awash in skin cells. It was amazing. It was like this. But it's shocking how much, and the whole realm of decomposers, the things that destroy all that is dead, or sometimes they get to them before they're dead, which is a problem that I have as an arborist, is there are many fungal organisms that are transported through the air and then decay trees when they're dead and sometimes before they're dead. But that's quite amazing to me, is that throughout the entire temperate world, and as far as things grow in the world, you will find in the air the spores of fungi and the actual organisms of bacteria that are using the air as a way to get around and get to the places they need to be in order to do their work. I had the good fortune to be with some wonderful mycologists over the weekend at a thing we call Spore Camp, where we all get to go and do nothing but collect stuff out of the air, but also scrape stuff off of decaying logs. And then, we'll all be looking in microscopes, and all of a sudden somebody will go, "Ooh, wow!" So I had my ooh, wow moment when I had this terribly decayed piece of bark. And it was just wonderfully terribly decayed. And I got a thin section of it under the microscope, and there must have been 50 or 60 organisms visible in it, decaying it, as I was fishing through the microscope. And all of those had come there through the air. So the air is very interesting to me as this transformer.
Les, jump in.
Well, for me, air is a fluid, and I didn't know anything about it, but we got the commission to do the World Trade Center downtown. My goodness, that was before some of you were born. And I took an apartment that looked out over the Empire State Building so that I could see how the air flowed around it. And later, we were able to develop wind tunnel testing, mathematical tools, and so forth, so as to sort out how air does flow around a building or doesn't, because sometimes when it doesn't flow, that's a big disadvantage. So both sides of it.
So I want to.
I just want, what's interesting, I was involved so many years ago in a lawsuit as an appraiser because of the wind that was coming around the old World Trade Center complex. And the Port Authority was being sued by Harry Helmsley, who had an adjoining building.
Right.
And he said the velocity of the air increased so rapidly that it was affecting the people who were going to work. They were getting, in some periods of time, the wind was so great that he felt that it was affecting his building.
Well, that's not impossible, of course. It's not just buildings that are affected. What happens in a tall building like the World Trade Center is that the air comes to the building and flows around it, of course, but it doesn't just do this. It does this and then that and this and that and causes a cyclic motion of the building. And maybe 5/8 of the way up the building, it kind of goes around and continues down. Above that, it flows up and around, sometimes over the top. And below that, it flows down and creates windiness at street level. Now, in some environments, windiness at street level is good. If we were in Singapore, for example, where it gets pretty hot and sticky and a breeze is pretty nice, then that's an attribute. But where it's cold, and then of course the wind is not an asset at all. And there are lots of ways that buildings can be formed so that the wind environment can actually be improved.
That makes me want to jump ahead, but I'm not going to. But yeah, I guess I'm going to ask you all to now be a tour guide and show us virtually somewhere in the city where we can see either a place or a building or a particular phenomenon that is shaped by the air in a way that we might not otherwise realize. So that a building that takes the shape it does because of air rights or you get where I'm going. So yeah, take us to somewhere that has been shaped by air in New York City.
I don't think buildings are shaped by the air. That is, buildings are shaped to accommodate the air or to accept the air, to use the air and so forth. But the air doesn't shape it. I mean, that's for deserts where the air actually shapes the ground. But buildings are a little sturdier than that, and so they're not actually shaped. But a lot of effort is put into major buildings, a huge amount of effort, to reduce the effects of the air on that building. If you take a tall building, let's say pretty tall building, 500 meters, the wind load against the building in many environments exceeds the floor load, perhaps by a factor as much as 5. The wind loads can be, again, about 5 times larger than the earthquake loads in Tokyo or Los Angeles. So wind's a dominant force in tall buildings.
And are there any buildings in New York that had their design tweaked during wind testing to be a different shape now than they might have been?
Well, I don't know about the design. I would say some of it. We worked with architects FX Fowl in their design of some of these new towers, all of which have been built, the buildings that are generally above 50 stories, and there are quite a few now, and there's many on the drawing boards, have been built with the purchase of air rights. You purchase air rights from the adjoining property, and then the property next to that, the property next to that. And like you look at one that's been around a long time is the Trump Tower on 48th Street and 49th Street and First Avenue. It's a 70-story building. It was only built because of that height because of the purchase of air rights. And then you have a new building to be built next to MoMA, which is a new apartment building on 6th Avenue. It'll be 75 stories. It's air rights. And then you have a new building built on 57th Street and Park Avenue on the, what would be the southwest corner. That's going to be about 90 stories. And then you have a guy called Gary Barnett, Extel, who's built the building on 57th Street, which is 90 stories now. It has a lot of notoriety, but it's only built with air rights, and my company assembled the air rights for that building going back to 2002. That's when it started. And in New York City, you have to buy little pieces in order to build it up. And then eventually you did get enough air rights to come up with that building. But they're all over. You see all these skinny towers, and they're all built with air rights, and they all have special wind bracing.
That's the one, that's the building where they had the problem with the crane, right?
That's
During
exactly
Sandy.
right, yes. The crane came down, well, leaned down.
Was that something that had to do with the way, just because of Sandy's extraordinary winds and their effects, or was there something in the
Yes,
structure of the crane
yes,
that was?
yes. I know from reading in the papers, there's an awful lot of problems with cranes.
Yeah.
Cranes are not necessarily the way they're supposed to be.
How do cranes do, I mean, they must be very hard to engineer because they're so massive and flat.
I don't think they're hard to engineer. I think they're hard to get built properly. I mean, the engineering's relatively straightforward. I mean, it's an object and it's in the wind, and that's what people do for a living.
So it was not, when that one that went in Sandy, it was just because it overcame the,
I don't know, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. So.
Les, there are some shapes that are, I guess, easier to wind engineer than others, or am I mistaking that? Like a cylinder versus a triangle or something like that?
We did a building in Pittsburgh for United States Steel Corporation until the big project in Japan. It was the largest privately owned building in the world. And the architects wanted to build a triangular shaped building, and the developer wanted to build a rectangular building. Good thinking on their part. And we convinced everybody with a combination of talking and wind tunnel testing that if we notched the corners of the triangle, we would get 6 corner offices instead of 3. Can't knock that. And significantly reduce the wind loads on the building.
That's great. Bill?
well, let's see. It would be something invisible. You would, if you were doing it as a tourist, you would probably do it in midsummer, and you probably wouldn't like it. And one of the things that the city has done to air is put into it so many aerosols, so many liquid and solid particles. In order for precipitation to fall, generally speaking, water droplets attach to what are called cloud condensation nuclei, which are aerosols. Used to be, before the industrial era, that there were more or less aerosols in the air. So you could have an air that was totally saturated with these water-containing aerosols and other air that was not. And that would affect the quality of the precipitation that could fall. As it happens now, there's always tons more aerosol in the air, many, many thousands more aerosols in the air that are necessary to combine with every possible bit of water in the air. So what happens is we have the sensation that when it's hot in New York, the air is a great deal soupier. And in actual fact, it is a great deal soupier because every little bit of water has combined with an aerosol in the air, and it's all hanging there waiting for some change to happen. Like two fronts to combine, which will lift air up, or some other force that will allow the air to rise to the point where the water can condense and fall. And then we have, as we experienced in, what was it, mid-July, when we would have those sudden downpours, it was just like the sky opened. We seem to have those a lot more now, and one of the reasons is the number of aerosols.
True.
So the stuff we put in our air changes the weather beyond just, climate change and whatnot? It
Yes.
literally changes it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Huh. Wow. Talking about the stuff in the air, this brings me to my next question, which is sort of the inverse, how city shapes air. If my last question was, how air is shaping parts of the city, this question is how how the city or different neighborhoods in the city affect their air differently. So this is where, Bill, I was hoping you could tell us about your survey of the city's, the content of the city's air.
Yeah, I'd be glad. I want to continue doing this. I was actually asked to do this by the Daily News. They said, we're going to send you around with a reporter and a photographer and your spore sucker. I have this little machine called a spore sucker, and it's made out of a small detail vacuum cleaner. And allergists use a kind of little cassette that you put double-sided tape on in order to take air samples with real spore suckers. They're really machines that are designed to take air samples. Mine is not, but it works very well, and it's extremely portable. It's about so big and looks like a robin with its wings folded, except for the cassette hanging on the end. So I would go into places where some of them I hid it. Like I went out into I went up to the top of the Empire State Building, and I would kind of just let it stick slightly out of my backpack in the hope that I wouldn't end up in a prison without a name, because it does look a little like a weapon. And let the thing run for 10 or 15 minutes and see what you get. And when they asked me to do this, I was a little afraid that we'd get the same thing in every neighborhood and we'd all be bored. But as it turns out, we didn't. We got kind of signature things in each neighborhood. We were in Brooklyn Heights, and we got a good deal of stuff that comes from highways, a good deal of black carbon, a little bit of tires, but a tremendous amount of just fungi, the spores of fungi, and also bits of plants, including plant hairs, trichomes, seen under the microscope are some of the most beautiful things you can imagine. They kind of look like flowering palm trees with pointed ends. So very, very beautiful and very kind of natural in that very nice part of Brooklyn Heights. Let's see, and then we went to Chinatown. It was almost lunchtime, and we got a tremendous amount of starch grains, of hexagonal starch grains. It was really quite beautiful, along with more of the combined stuff that we had been seeing, some organic and some inorganic. Then we went up to near the Port Authority bus terminal. And there we had almost entirely skin cells and black carbon. That is carbon from exhaust pipes and also carbon off tires, as well as some interesting fibers, blue jeans and other things. You get really beautiful fiber things. Of course, we got silk fibers only in Williamsburg, but we got some fibers there as well. And a little bit, actually, there was something was obviously happening over on the edge of Manhattan because something had blown in a whole bunch of smut spores, and smut attacks grasses. So something had come in. So interesting, the pathway that led it there, because you wouldn't see how it could happen. But the good thing was that it was Port Authority, and I figured nobody actually lives there. They get to go and come. Then finally we went to the Bruckner Expressway, right below the Bruckner. So there's the expressway above, and there's the Bronx Terminal Market, 8 lane, 8 lanes above, 8 lanes below. And it was solid black carbon. After we took this, I have to go back and do it, so we didn't know exactly what it was made out of when I left there, but it was just terrifying. There was nothing in it but carbon. It was the same as, an indoor sample has nothing but skin cells. This had nothing but carbon. And what was most terrifying was that there was a public school half a block away from the site where we took this. So kids are here all the time, every day, and it made me think a lot more about, for example, in the Bronx, the high prevalence of asthma, because the Bronx is a small borough that is crisscrossed by major highways. And I haven't done a study of this, but thought it might be an interesting thing to look into, to what extent that amount of continual polluting materials are causing some of those asthma problems. Since asthma is an inflammation, it's where you breathe something in, and if you are sensitive to it, it causes an inflammation of the airways.
I have a question for you, a valuation question. With all these new buildings going up, that up 70, 80, 90 stories, can I possibly talk to somebody about having pure air on the top versus the midsection and the bottom?
You probably could in terms of carbon, because the carbon's, it would take a good updraft, I would imagine, to get some of the heavier parts of it all the way up. On the other hand, the highest bacterial spore that's been recovered, viable spore, has been recovered from 253,000 feet.
Oh.
So they're getting some stuff up there. But the other thing is, you don't want air to be pure. It would be inert if it were pure. The only thing that you don't like is a whole lot of carbon.
Would the quality be better the higher you go?
Very likely. It's because especially those aerosols tend to be fairly heavy.
All right.
I had 2 points on that. One is that if you're interested in air quality, do not go to Beijing or Shanghai. I mean, You think air's bad here. You have no idea, unless you've been to those places, how bad it is. The other is that there's a kind of a beneficial aspect of all of this, and I mentioned that the air sort of flows around a building. Now, if you think that there's rainwater in the air, and rainwater generally has particles in it, by the way, the rainwater is heavier than the air, so the air is able to go around the building, but a lot of the rainwater hits the building itself. And if you go to a tall, generally stone-faced building, you can see that the corners are generally nice and clean, and the middle is all dirty.
So the movement of the air around the building is washing it?
Right.
Just the corners?
Exactly.
You should design a building so it gets entirely washed.
Entirely corners. I could see the architects sharpening their pencils right now. Bob, I wanted to ask you specifically how the city is engineering a new market in air rights right now in Midtown. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, they have a whole program that we've been involved with, which is the Midtown East redevelopment program, where they're redesigning the existing zoning to permit developers, to buy development improvement, so to speak, FAR from the city. And the whole reason that the city is trying to do this is to give owners a benefit, to give them more profit, so they would then go ahead and demolish some of the older buildings, the older office buildings that are in the Midtown area. The majority of the buildings in the Midtown area are over 70 years old. So, and they're less conducive to modern types of office activities. So the city would like them to be replaced. So it gives developers a bonus where they could buy what they call DIBs, development improvement bonuses, for a price which is much cheaper than the purchase of land. The city just created a whole bunch of air rights, an unlimited amount, and it's available for developers who have sites of 25,000 square feet and 200 feet along an avenue. So with that in mind, you could buy DIBs, three DIBs, and increase your density, depending on which zone you are in, from a 15 FAR to a 31 FAR. So a 31 FAR, so you can consider you have a site of 25,000 square feet, and it's going to now be 31 times the size of the 25,000 square feet. So and with other bonuses, you're getting buildings of 1 million square feet and more.
And what's extraordinary about this, or what's different about this, is that normally you would have to acquire those air rights by a slow and painful transfer process from a lot of different people. But in this case, the air is not being transferred from anywhere, right?
No, it's being transferred from the city. The city has an unlimited reservoir of air that it has just created, and it's selling it to developers who would like to buy it. And the purchase price is $250 in FAR, if anybody wants to buy any, as a site. And if you want to develop residential, you're allowed also to have what would be a mixed-use building. And there, the purchase price is higher. It's at $360. But you have to consider that fee land for residential purposes is now selling at somewhere around $500, $550 or more per FAR. So it's a deal. It's a good deal to go and buy it from the city if you want to redevelop.
I have a really quick question about that, actually. So you can buy land without owning, you can buy air rights without owning the land underneath the air. Or do you have to own the piece of property to acquire air rights above?
You have to own the fee land, and you're buying air rights to pile on top of the fee land generally. So you have to own something, a piece of property, and has certain zoning for it, which allows you to build a certain height. And then you generally buy air from the adjoining property. That's the way it's always been. You purchase the air from the adjoining property and pile it on top of your building.
You kind of love the idea of owning a pocket of
Yeah.
Moving around like this nice square foot.
In this particular case, because the city is selling you brand new air, as it were, and you're not having to buy it from contiguous patches, is there anything that would stop me from buying some air in Midtown?
Yes, you would have to have a site of 25,000 square feet.
Oh,
So,
minor detail.
We can't make that up the way the city made up the air? Do they make up the air, or is just the air on top? What do they imagine?
they made up
the
the
air
air.
is? They just made
It's
it up?
no, it's no reservoir of air, it's just that you have the right to develop an extra 3 FAR on your site, or a 5 FAR or a 6 FAR extra. All you have to do is pay the city $250 per square foot for every square foot that you buy or use.
How smart on the city's part.
Well, the money's supposed to be used to add to the infrastructure in the immediate vicinity where the building is going to be built. And many of the buildings are near subways, so the extra money is going to go into the subways to renew the entrances into the subways and refurbish the actual station itself.
I like that. It seems appropriate to take money from the air and plow it underground like that. I'd like to ask each of you, actually, how New York City's air is different from other cities around the world. Is there a market in air rights elsewhere in the world?
Generally not. It's a New York phenomenon. It's certainly in Chicago, but it's because Manhattan is so dense, and because Manhattan is so built up, there's no place to buy vacant land. Basically, it's always built, or so you you go ahead and you try to develop these high buildings. And in New York City, the higher it is, the more valuable it is. So the higher the building is, you'll get a higher office rent, you'll get a higher retail, you'll get a higher residential rent, or a higher condominium or co-op price when you go up in height. So there's a huge profit potential, and people and developers are out there buying height. That's what they're doing.
Les, how about New York City air or wind compared to other cities that you've worked in?
Well, air has many properties, so you're probably thinking of speed.
Yeah.
New York's sort of in the middle. There's the really high wind speed areas are places like the Philippines and so forth, where wind speeds are about 4 times larger than New York. On the other side of the coin, you go to the Middle West, and you have tornadoes, and they're higher wind speed than any other place on the planet, or that don't have tornadoes. Lots of places have tornadoes, not just the United States. So the place to build, if wind speed is in your mind, I say, is go to a place on the equator where the wind hardly ever blows, and try to find one where they don't have earthquakes, and then you can build very light, airy buildings, and people do.
Does the grid layout change how the wind moves? Does that change how the wind affects your building? That's something I always wonder, the grid system in American cities as opposed to European cities that are not gridded.
You're talking about the street grid?
Yeah.
Well, the issue is largely the taller buildings bringing air down to the lower buildings. So I don't know. I mean, a meandering path is very good for things like collecting debris, which tends to run down streets. So if you're in Florida, for example, wind speeds in Florida are not much different than New York, actually. Then the kind of curving street system is better in terms of protecting homes and so forth than the straight through.
And does New York have any weather particularities or air particularities that you stumbled across?
Well, it's interesting. I think the grid also, we encounter as arborists, I don't think the air itself is different, significantly different, But we encounter in New York some really strange phenomena, particularly in summer convective storms. We get all kinds of odd breakage that we wouldn't expect. I mean, in Sandy, you expect trees to go over. When the wind's over 70 miles per hour, forget about it. The tree can be as healthy as you want, and it can lose a major piece or even come over from the base. But what we encounter is all kinds of strange and interesting breaks in trees that are occasioned by winds that, instead of just blowing through, seem to blow through, swirl around, and very often go up. So we have cracks that often occur in branches that are bent slightly like this. The wind will lift them up, and when they do, the normal places that bear the load are suddenly not bearing load, but where there's, in the middle of the branch, where there's normally no load, all of a sudden there's a tremendous amount of load, and you get these opening cracks in the middle of branches, which can create what we call in arboriculture hazard beams. They're much less obvious than other kinds of breaks in trees, but they're something that we really need to pay attention to, and they're occasioned by the way that the wind is working in the city grid.
That's interesting. I guess I would like to know about changes in each of your fields over time. So the way the air rights market has evolved in Manhattan, the way that wind engineering has become a discipline over time, and also the way our understanding of air in general has changed over time. You can go in whatever order you want.
Well, with myself, it goes back quite a while. The first major assignment I worked on that was for air rights was City Center building. It was a theater on 57th Street, and it was, the city of New York was interested in selling its air rights, which was a new phenomenon. That was in the 70s. It was selling them to the adjoining property owner, who was going to build a gigantic, or at that time, considered a gigantic apartment building called City Spire with a big top, special top on it. It was about 65-story building, one of the tallest. So we did a study on air rights and as to what air rights should sell for. We studied basically the increase in the construction cost, because now we're going to be so much higher than we would normally be. And we found that the actual increase in the construction costs with the wind bracing necessary for a 65-story, 70-story building offset the actual cost, the benefit that you would get from purchasing the air rights. So and that was my first experience. That was probably in the early 1970s.
Was that instance the first transfer of air rights, or do they go back a bit further than that?
They go back a bit further than that. They actually go back. The first case was actually where you took some of your samples of air in Manhattan, where you come off the George Washington Bridge and you drive through these apartment buildings that are above the actual axis, right? And it's disgusting to come through there, and it's where so many accidents are, because you're like in a pit as you go through. And those buildings were built on air rights.
And the first ones in New York?
First ones.
Who
Goes
came
back
up
to the 60s.
Who came up with the concept? Who's the granddaddy of your field?
I don't know who's responsible for those buildings.
They should be held
But they're
responsible.
really,
Or irresponsible, maybe.
Can you imagine living in those buildings with all those fumes coming up?
Absolutely.
Are air rights a federal or by state basis? Like, or is it by city? Like, who comes up with the idea of air rights? Is it a federal, like, is there a federal laws around it, or is it?
On what? On air rights?
Yeah, like,
No, it's a city. It was created actually with a Grand Central Terminal case, where the city had the Landmarks Commission wanted to forestall the redevelopment of Grand Central Terminal. There was a desire to build a skyscraper on top of it, designed by a Marcel Breuer, a French architect. And it was moving along pretty fast. Penn Central, which was the owner of Grand Central at that time, was all in favor of it, and it went to the building department to get a building permit to build this 70 or 80-story building, which would be bigger than at that time it was the Pan Am building or the MetLife building. It was going to be taller. And so what happened is that the city said, no, we don't want that building there. And so let's declare the Grand Central Terminal a landmark. And then we'll create certain landmark laws where you have the right, if you're a landmark, you have the right to transfer your air rights to an adjoining property, or in this case, it was to properties up to 5 blocks away. And that way, the owners of Grand Central Terminal could get a reasonable profit on their money. And it went to the Supreme Court and and I testified on it. I was the guy who testified on it on behalf of the Landmarks Commission. And then it went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they said, yes, it's the right thing to do, and it created landmark law, and it created really a huge movement in the sale of air rights.
Can you steal air rights?
Can you what?
Can you steal them or pirate them in any fashion?
Steal them?
Theoretically?
This is the kind of audience we
No.
get at Studio X.
No, you can't.
I'm sure there's a way.
Yeah. You can put on a mask and try to steal them. No.
Breathe them in and hide.
Les, I know wind engineering has changed a great deal
Huge,
since the early
yes.
days.
The Empire State Building, for example, was designed for no wind load for, I think it was the first 60 feet. That is, buildings that were 60 feet or lower, whatever the number was, need not be designed for any wind load at all. And above 60 feet, or whatever that number is, they were designed for 20 pounds a square foot. Now, we know from the work that we've done that the wind loads are closer to 5 times that. Are the buildings unsafe? No, they're not unsafe, because the structural system that was assumed by the designers, steel frame, has infill masonry that stiffens and strengthens those buildings enormously. So once in a while you read about how we'll add on top of the Empire State Building. It's a nice idea, but there's kind of no science behind it right now to be able to actually do that. So that changed, that all changed because of the World Trade Center. We developed the kind of science, if you will, of wind engineering on buildings and bridges. And that made a monumental change in the character of the buildings themselves, particularly the structural system.
I'm curious as to how it's continued to evolve. So I know for the World Trade Center, you started using models in a wind tunnel. Is that still the way it's done? Do you still make gorgeous little models of the world's tall buildings and stick them in a tunnel somewhere?
Well, first of all, it takes a very special kind of tunnel. You need what's called a boundary layer wind tunnel. That's a wind tunnel that slows the air close to the ground and allows it to increase with height up to about 500 meters, and then it's more or less constant above that. So you need a special kind of wind tunnel. Unlike a wind tunnel that tests airplanes, it's very different.
It's a wind tunnel that's imitating what the atmosphere does.
Right. It was an idea that was not developed by us. It was developed by two Danish engineers who looked at wind loads on barns, and they found that in their wind tunnel, the wind load on the roof was down. We all know it's up. So they kept mucking around with it until finally they added upstream roughness and they found suction. We just took that concept and escalated it rather dramatically vertically for the Trade Center. But the nature of the wind on a building is associated with its location on the planet, its location with its environment, its shape, height, density, on and on, structural properties. Generally speaking, the swaying motion of a building can exceed the kind of steady state part. That is, the wind blows on the building, and let's say the building leans downwind. It doesn't go straight downwind, but it more or less downwind. And then it oscillates mostly side to side. And that's what creates the design. The side-to-side motion, the question is how much it was. Nobody had ever found out before. We found out how much it was, but we didn't know what the criteria was, so we built motion simulators and tested people and see how they responded to to the motion of the building.
What is an acceptable level of sway?
It depends on your age. I mean, if you take a baby, I mean, we do this, right? so it's very much, but around 10 millig's is the perception level for, let's say, 90% of the population. And at 20 millig's, twice that, anything above that, it's hard for the human to discern the difference. So it's kind of complicated because it has to do with recurrence interval of windstorms, and it's a big problem for computers.
So you still test in tunnels?
Absolutely, absolutely. Wind tunnels are a lot better than they were because when we went into it, there was no wind tunnel around that we could use that actually would test the buildings. So we had to take an existing wind tunnel and rework it. It turned out to be very expensive, but proved to be enormously valuable.
Oh, wait, sorry, we have a question in the back.
Are wind tunnels actually more informative than computers?
There's no real reliable mathematical tool for predicting the dynamic response of a building shape in a turbulent wind. I mean, there are estimates that can be put together, but the wind tunnel models, they're not so little. I mean, depending on what you're testing, they can be several stories high. Most of them are a couple of meters high, and they're all kinds. Use one kind of wind tunnel model to test the pressures on the facade because the glass is subject to a fluctuating pressure, and glass is stronger for short-term loading than it is for long-term loading. So you have to deal with the difference between the kind of fluctuating part and the steady state part to actually design the glass. Interesting enough, the strength of glass isn't even tested in the manufacturing process. All that's tested is the polish, if you will, the smoothness of the glass, which has a profound effect on the strength.
Wow. You had a question in front? Oh, cool. Well, I'd actually like to get into some more about models and the instruments and models that you use to measure and test the air. Now, Bill, you've described your spore sucker. Is this something that people can make at home, a spore sucker?
Yes. Yes, I'd be happy to give anyone a basic idea of how to build a spore sucker. It's quite simple.
And can you tell me, you modeled it after a French scientist, is that right? The guy who collected samples around Paris?
Oh, yeah. They're one of the first people to do this. Mine is not modeled on his. His was a long time ago. There was a man who decided he would study invisible Paris. He was a contemporary of Pasteur, and he thought that he could find out a lot about human disease by seeing how bacteria and fungi traveled around Paris. And he managed he was the first person to really do counts of the invisible spores and bacterial cells in the air.
What did he use?
He used something similar. He used a sticky slide, and he also had, people are doing this, I'm doing this just to see what's there. The people who are doing this to find out things about air quality are usually using something where they know exactly what rate the air is being sucked through it at. That way they can study, say, a cubic meter and say what's in a cubic meter of air. So in midwinter, as I learned at Spore Camp this weekend, in midwinter, you might find 30 spores in a cubic meter of air. But someone was telling about a particularly nice damp day in the Adirondacks 25 years ago, when I think they figured there were 500,000 spores in a cubic meter of air in midsummer, after a nice rainstorm in midsummer. So tremendous amount of difference. And in fact, one of the participants in that conference went into anaphylactic shock.
Yeah.
Because all these mycologists were bringing their samples in from outdoors. There was a tremendous amount. If you'd walked in there clean, you would smell nothing but fungi, right? Nothing but mold, and she couldn't take it because it was too great a density.
There is
You know,
too much of
it's
a good thing.
interesting that this subject of wind engineering is not new. I mean, Eiffel had a room way up on top of his tower. He was not a great engineer, in my opinion, but he did interesting work on the Eiffel Tower. People studied the lean of ships, measuring the wind speed, and then to get the lean to find out what the forces are and so forth. It was not, not without a history, if you will. It was the boundary layer wind tunnel that changed the whole character.
The trick. And can you talk a little bit about the different, I know you said there are plenty of different kinds of models, but I just wondered if you could describe some of the different, like if you were putting the World Trade Center towers in again, what different models would you make of them?
Okay. There are two fundamental kinds of models, or maybe three if you want to think it that way. One kind of model is used to develop the pressures on the facade. It has a whole bunch of pressure taps, maybe 500 pressure taps, and each tap measures both the steady state and the fluctuating pressure.
These are the little models that look like they have spaghetti in them? They have like cables?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Because they're little tubes that go down, yes. They go to a transducer, and then after they've got all of those pressure taps are kind of statistically stable, then they measure more and more and more until they have them all done. Then they turn the model a tiny little bit and do it again and again and again. Going to wind tunnel is a little bit like watching the submarine races. I mean, there's nothing really to be seen. So then there's the kind of model in which the forces at the base are measured. So forces this way, that way, and this way. But they're static models. They don't move. And then there are models which are hinged at the base in all directions so that they go back and forth this way and that way and twist and so forth. And then there are multi-sectional models that actually follow the mode shape of the building itself. They get more and more complex, and probably with the complexity goes a loss in reliability. The technique for making the models has changed enormously. Now they're very fast to build. We go through them in a couple of days.
And they used to take
Yes?
months?
So
or?
if you came to our offices, you'd see lots of wind tunnel models, which look just like they do with the wind tunnel. You can't tell the difference.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, it's now your guys' chance to jump in with questions, so well done.
Say in parallel with the model making and the wind tunnel stuff, in parallel the industry of visual effects, for example, do you ever see films or cinematic moments where you just think a building would never move or fall in that way because it's exaggerated for cinema? Or do the two industries ever cross? Because they do model a lot of dynamic simulations of effects and debris and so on. In the
Of
same
course.
way. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, well, the debris, that's a completely separate subject. We haven't gotten around to that one, but debris generation, which classical would be the case of a gravel top roof, and the wind comes along and blows gravel onto the windows next door.
Did
And
you ever see yourself working with, say, a visual effects CGI artist to figure out the engineered bias strengths of predicted?
of course, yes.
Do you ever
Yeah.
get,
That would make a great film.
I guess. As I say, I did say that it's a little bit like watching the submarine races, right? It's
do you ever get asked to advise on, I know you, as well as buildings, you guys, well, do you work on bridges as well?
Yes.
Does it have to be a building? What else would you, a structure? What other kinds of things would you put in your wind tunnel?
Well, the difference is in bridges, generally, the whole structural system is modeled so that the motion of the model and the motion of the full-scale bridge are not identical, but they're highly related. Whereas buildings, most of the wind tunnel work is not done like that, and isn't needed to, by the way. I'm sure you've all seen photographs of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge as it came tumbling down.
Galloping
Actually, that's interesting because that tells you something about culture. I was shown that movie one time at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington in the UK. And I looked at it and I looked at it, and then it suddenly hit me. In the UK, they drive on the opposite side of the road, so the film was shown turned over.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about any other catastrophic failures of wind engineering?
I mean, there's a huge number. I mean, wind is a great destroyer of the works of man and nature. So I would say that major buildings have suffered. By major, I mean, I'm not talking about wooden houses or something. I'm talking about buildings of consequence. Particularly in tornadoes in the United States have suffered terrible damage. And not necessarily total failure, but at least partial failure. But a very tall building has one advantage over many other kinds of systems, and that is it's clad. And generally the cladding is glass. And so as the glass breaks, then the air starts going through the building. That adds enormously to the damping, reduces the loads, and it's kind of like a life belt for the building itself.
Is there any systems that take advantage of that to improve a building's resilience?
I've never found anyone who would do that. No, don't misunderstand me. I mean, we study it ourselves for our own purposes, but we don't take that to the building department or something. I mean,
How about if you designed it in the shape of a tree? Because trees do that with damping, by having branches up and down, the little tree shape.
well, I mean, the best example I think would be if you go into a place like Hawaii, where these wonderful trees that have a tiny little root ball at the bottom, and the leaves, the fronds, if you will, actually deformed to become more aerodynamic. So they're able to survive with a very small root ball and very tall tree.
Elliot.
I wanted to just throw out something that came up earlier, the idea that maybe the air up above is more pure than down below. The Bank of America building, which we can see from here, is actually pumping air from the top of the building down into the building for its tenants to breathe. But I wanted to ask a question about air rights and what you can do with them. Is it just for building, or can you use air rights for other things? Could you temporarily build, or could you land air vehicles? Like, is there any other use for air rights besides just a standard skyscraper?
Well, they're not only used for the standard skyscraper, they're used for a lot of residential buildings and townhouses that are 4 or 5 stories high. They're using extra air that they have and they can develop above their townhouse. Many of the townhouses, most of them are located between the avenues, and the zoning between the avenues is not that dense. Generally it's about a 4 FAR. So and the lots are 20 by 100, so it's 4 times 20 by 100, it's 8,000 square feet. And the average townhouse is about 5,000 square feet. So they all have air rights. If it's not a landmark, you can sell your air rights to the adjoining property, and they could create a 7 or 8 or 10-story building out of it.
Can you buy air rights and sit on them to preserve your own view? So say you have a nice roof deck and you don't want your neighbors to build up. Can you buy their air rights
Yes.
and then just hold on to them?
Yes, you can. And it's done quite often. They call them light easements, but
Okay.
you're going down to, you're purchasing air rights to preserve a view. You have a building on the site and you don't want any building to be built next to it that's any higher. So you purchase the air rights and they just stay as air rights, and nobody ever develops anything, but you preserve your view. And then you have a whole other consideration, which is a building consideration, that if you buy air rights next to a building and it's located between the side streets, say from 48th Street to 49th Street, it's on 3rd Avenue, and it's in the middle of the block, and you want to develop it. Well, you cannot build windows along the side street location. You can have lot line windows, but you can't have normal windows. But if you buy the air rights from the adjoining property is merged with your property, and now you can put windows up. So it makes a big difference.
Wow. You had a question there?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just coming back from downtown Brooklyn, where I've heard anecdotally, I don't know if this is true, but that there's a certain limitation of how high the buildings have gotten in downtown Brooklyn. One is I guess the bank, the clock tower there.
Yes.
And what is the future of downtown Brooklyn looking like? Are buildings going to start getting higher and higher there, or is there a limitation of the height that they can go to?
Well, it seems if you can buy air rights in downtown Brooklyn, you can continually go up. There's no legal restriction on it. There are many different groups which would like to prohibit people from developing these very high buildings, like Donald Trump, when he was building his building on 48th Street, 49th Street, there was a huge community opposition, and they had lawsuits. But he had the right to do it, so he did it. And it's very hard to prevent.
Has there been much community organizing about taking the air as a common? As in, like 596 acres but for the air, or a community land trust but for the air, based on the premise of the air quality as a health, as a common?
I don't follow your question. If the,
It's like working outside the operation of owning air and monetizing it in a way, as like, you know, how 596 acres takes land, can change them for the community into public community gardens. But if you take that same application and apply it to the air as on the premise of needing healthy air, since there's such an asthma corridor along the BQE, like has there
Well,
ever been a movement?
there are ways. If you want to, you have a garden, and there are city gardens, and you want to preserve it, you can sell the air rights to the adjoining property. And there is a movement within the city by a bunch of different landlords who would like to have the opportunity to buy the air from landmarks and also from gardens that want to be preserved, and there you would have a natural garden that would be there forever.
So it's a way of preserving your community garden
Yes, but
from developers.
It hasn't happened yet, but there's so many different things that are moving forward with respect to air rights. It might happen.
It's really
But they
interesting.
would build up then next to, they would have the right then to build
No,
higher
they
next to
would
the
have the
garden.
right to transfer it in a neighborhood.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be
It doesn't
contiguous.
it wouldn't be next to the building. It would be transferred to the neighborhood. Other buildings in the neighborhood, it would take the air from a side street and probably build a building on an avenue.
So, yeah.
I'd like to check on something that's either completely referring to or the reality, but there are very obviously reasons for wanting to have a tree-lined street, and then all of a sudden somebody came up with the notion that is a good thing because the air quality goes up. And then somebody came along and says, no, that's not true at all, because the air quality in the street actually goes down because of those trees, because the air movement in the street is not just, there's less wind, there's less, the aerosols stay in the street because of the streets. Is that under fairy tale, or is that actually how?
Well, it's certainly true. I mean, we know because we climb a lot of trees on those streets, and usually at the end of the day, our hands are and our sleeves are quite black. So the trees certainly do pick up a lot of stuff going through that's going down the streets. I don't know. That's the whole ecosystem services argument. I understand. I mean, I just follow it. Is generally speaking a good one because trees put out a lot more oxygen, a lot more things that are useful to people. They also control temperatures. There's a lot of things they do that are, so I think on balance, the services are certainly one thing that on balance is positive for trees. Yeah, probably they do catch a lot of the stuff going by, but they seem to actually catch it on themselves, if our experience is any guide. But the other thing about it is that the guy who is kind of the great guru and teacher of most of us who are arborists now is a man named Alex Shigo, who totally changed the way we understand tree physiology and how it interacts with the wind and world around it. And at the beginning of every of his books, every one of his books, the motto is written, "Touch trees." And you know, this is a scientist. And I think it's quite true. We find in the city that it's not only a question of what the trees are doing for you, but people who have an affection for them have an extraordinarily strong affection. It's, I think, their main relationship to nature for many people living in the city. So we've been up pruning a tree to save it, and we've had people lean out the window and say, "We're calling the cops, you're hurting our tree." You know, on the other hand, of course, there are people who want to get rid of them, but by and large, I think people want them not only for the services, but also because it's a touch. It's something that's alive and different from them.
At the back.
I'm curious about the relationship between private estates and like public interest, and whether or not we have like a public or kind of legal framework that allows me to voice my concerns about air quality, not being just from a neighbor being adjoining the property, but a person down the street. To have a say about the property that is coming out.
Is there a mechanism for members of the public to interfere in or protest about air rights transfers?
I mean, I guess a good example of that would be the ban of sort of smoking cigarettes indoors. It's recently passed for the collective public interest. You know, if I have a barbecue joint down the street that is constantly, I don't know, it's just barbecuing, and would I have a right, is there an existing legal framework that allows me to say something about that, or allows me to change something?
Oh, air quality.
Yeah.
Okay. Any ideas?
I don't know. It's an interesting question, but you know, it's certainly true that we don't have a very sophisticated understanding of air quality, except for we understand toxins a lot better than we understand about allergens, what they are, but we don't understand how they work. And the big thing that is happening in the cities as we get more and more aerosol load of all different kinds is we don't seem to understand very much about what happens when there's simply too much of something going in and out of our lungs. That's certainly one reason why in the World Trade Center there was such a vast underestimate of the danger of the air there, because it wasn't so much, they looked for toxins, and the toxin load was not negligible, but it wasn't as great as they thought it was going to be. But what happened was all of these new kinds of particles, which are not toxic in themselves, but were of exactly the right size and shape to get into the airways and even into the lungs, are what are now causing people all kinds of problems. So certainly we need to understand a lot more about what happens when you just have a large load of material, not necessarily toxic, not even necessarily allergenic, but such that it gets into our airways. So I think more needs to be done.
There was in Long Island City, years and years ago, there was a meat rendering plant that was, some of its equipment must have broke down, and there was this horrible odor that would float over the city from Long Island City, coming into Manhattan, and eventually the city did close them down. So there must have been some kind of mechanism to handle that.
There's a framework for odor reporting because of nuisance, but invisible particles, I don't know. So what we're going to do now is I think it's time to let my panelists get down from their stools and get a glass of wine. But you should all stay and get a glass of wine and ask them all the rest of the questions that you have for them. But in the meantime, let's give them a round of applause for